Well, we're getting closer to the Christmas season, and this is probably going to be the last album that I review until the new year. So what better way to bring it in than with my fun sweater? And it also jingles. Yeah. Everyday Life by Coldplay. I know that was a very strange introduction, but sometimes you just gotta be a little bit wonky. So Coldplay. Why am I even releasing a review for Coldplay? Well, I actually really enjoy Coldplay. Ew, my hair. Jeez, let's fix that up right now. There we go. I really enjoy Coldplay. I got their X and Y album for free way back when I was in university when it first came out, and it has some really tasty tracks on there. I really liked the title track and Twisted Logic, and I mean, Fix You is still really fun. It forced me to go back and listen to Cold Rush to the Head, which had some really tasty tracks on there as well. Now, I devoured and fell in love with Viva La Vida. Viva La Vida is my favorite album from Coldplay, hands down. It's not just a really fun pop rock album, it's just a really fun album overall. Unfortunately, the album that kind of came after that has been less than stellar. Milo Loxioto or whatever it was. That one was still pretty good. It still had some bangers on it, but I could feel like they were really stretching the runtime on there with a lot of filler tracks. I personally really love Ghost Stories. I love the presentation. I love the grieving process from that album. And I think because it ends on such a big track, I believe it's called A Sky Full of Stars, because it ends on such a really big high note, all of the rest of the album from it is just fantastic. Now, the last album they put out, what was it? I want to say I call it Kaleidoscope, but I think it's A Head Full of Stars or something like that. Oh boy, what a stinker. That was not a good album at all. Like, I can barely get through it. It is just a whew. What we have here, I'm going to split this album review into 3 parts because I think that's the easiest way for me to talk about this album. The first part will be the concept of this album and the 2 parts of this album. Next one will actually be talking about the music that's found within it, and the final one will be kind of the execution and missteps of this album, because each kind of influence the next. So the concept of this album I actually really enjoy. I really like the concept of this album. Concept of this album is essentially that it is a part of everyday life across the globe in all meanings of the word. It's tackling the big joys, it's tackling the low lows, it's all things. It's one of those, we're all one people, so let's look at the album and the everyday life as holistic as possible. And it does kind of foster in and around this we're all one people kind of a thing. And like, this could be a really interesting concept. I do like this concept of this is just everyday life, and we're going to tackle all the different aspects and facets of that, and we're going to deal with those in different musical styles. So there's a lot of different musical styles that's found upon this. Now, they do split this into 2. There's Sunrise and Sunset, both hovering around, Sunrise is about 28 minutes, and Sunset is about 25 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the music at this point, because I feel like it starts to blend into that aspect, because Sunrise holds 2 of my favorite tracks, and Sunset holds 2 of the weaker tracks. So already the album is a little bit unbalanced. The 2 tracks that I can't help but love is Trouble in Town and Arboresque. And that's the 3rd and the 7th track. And even though I'm not a big fan of how they split this album up into being 2 albums, I still feel like this should have been 1 album on 2 different sides. But the way that they did structure it, I'm guessing that both of these tracks fall as the second last track of the runtime on each disc. So in that sense, this first disc feels very whole to me, in that the second last track is the big pinnacle. It's the big track that has been led up to at this point. I like how both of these tracks really build to something grandiose. and they both build in different ways. Trouble in Town is essentially kind of a power struggle between the citizens and the police, and how that can cause friction, and how this friction can build into something very, very dangerous. Whereas Arboresque is much more of a celebration that we're all the same. I could be you, you could be me. We're all the same blood, and this is what it really builds toward, of like, why are we fighting? Why are these power struggles happening when we're all the same? We're all just individuals of circumstance. We're all kind of unified as being this one peoples. And so it kind of builds right up into that big grandiose part. And that's one of the things that I did really, really enjoy, is even though some people have said the mixing isn't all that great in Arboresque, I actually enjoy it. I do like the fact that Chris Martin's vocals, when we get to that big crescendo, is very quiet, which just makes all the sound around it seem that much bigger. I love how they infuse this track with a lot of horn section, a very great saxophone solo on there. I think this builds towards what we were hoping for within this We're All the Same Blood, because they're utilizing a lot of different characteristics and a lot of different personalities on there. This is very stark contrast to Trouble in Town, which builds just based on the band that's around them. The only build that we have is this this narration that we have between what we can presume are street cops and the public, and kind of the power struggle that they have. Unfortunately, this first half of Sunrise still has a few less than exciting moments on it. Broken, Daddy, and When I Need a Friend. These tracks are the somber tracks off of this, and sometimes they work. Like When I Need a Friend and Broken are both the come down tracks, and they're both about the same length, about 2.5 minutes, very, very short. Broken being more of like a gospel church, it's just Martin and this church choir singing around, and almost like a celebration of life, which is a really interesting pair when we come off of Trouble in Town. I do feel Daddy's a little bit melodramatic, and it's a little bit too on the nose. This is, again, something I'm going to be talking about in a little bit when I'm comparing this to another artist that's been doing what Coldplay is trying to do, and that's Peter Gabriel. I feel like Daddy is just a really bad, cheesy version of Father and Son. I don't know. It feels forced. It doesn't feel organic. I just don't really get it. And then the track that I hadn't talked about, WOTW and POTP. I don't know exactly what those stand for. Anyway, it's just Martin, and I'm kind of wondering why it's doing here. Like, this first half is the longest, and I would trim quite a bit. Like, I'd cut Daddy and WOTW right off, because there's a lot of pit stops on this album to feel out, but it never really stays too long for anything. And this is kind of the really big part of the second half of Sunset, where it opens up with Guns, and Guns is a really fun track. Like, it's very poppin', it's very fun, but it's only about like less than 2 minutes, so I don't really get enough time in the track to really experience it. And this is where I want to talk about the two not so great tracks off of this. This is where I feel like the band is getting back into their old rut. Like, I feel like they were trying to grow away from this style, and they didn't. And that's the song of Orphans and a little bit of Champions of the World. Like, both of these tracks have that really high octave guitar work that I'm not a big fan of. It never really worked for me when they were trying it with Milo Zoloto or A Head Full of Dreams. And I feel like they really needed to grow past this. But both of these tracks still utilize that, and I'm not a big fan of this. I just feel like it's forced. It's a shorthand for what they're trying to get at in terms of emotionally that they could have found in other ways. And they feel very similar. Like, they feel very carbon copied of one another. I did enjoy the fact that they're starting to stretch their legs a little bit more and trying different things as well. Like, Cry, Cry, Cry feels like a 1930s or 40s track. I really like the different blending of genres that we have within this. And it fits very well in between, I think it's Eco or maybe Echo, as well as Old Friends. Both of these tracks are a little bit more subdued. They're a little bit more subtle. And so I like the blending of styles in that sense. And it provides a very, very crisp and clean listen. And I also love just how, like, I guess intimate Echo is. Like, I feel like if they cut Orphans out, it would have blended really well from Guns into, again, it might be Eco, could be Echo. Because I love how just intimate this song is. This one doesn't feel forced. It actually feels like one of the most genuine tracks off the entire album. Martin is feeling very vulnerable, but in a very real sense. It's not a forced vulnerability of like, I'm an artist and I'm gonna bare my soul. It's much more of a, hey, this is where I'm at right now. And that's it. And I feel like that is a very, very smart move on Coldplay for putting the song where it is. And I also feel like Old Friends kind of does the same thing. And Old Friends, I do feel kind of, I don't know, I feel like they've already gone through this a little bit. And as I mentioned, this is probably why I'm not a big fan of the second half of the album, because at this point, we've already got Echo that's already doing what this track of Old Friends is doing. And we've already had a number of tracks already like this, such as When I Need a Friend from the first half. Then we come into, I don't even know how to pronounce it, and I'm not going to try. Essentially, I Google Translate it. It's Persian for Benny Adams. And this track is interesting. I like the piano ballad that's on this, but it's only a piano work for half the track. The other half gets back into this really strange sounds that were leading up to Champion of the World. I feel like if they had just lengthened out that first half of Benny Adams, I think it would have done a really, really good job of providing us into the final track of Everyday Life. And the title track itself is actually a really good track. I love how they end this album off. Like, I like how big it is. I like how they're trying different styles. It almost feels like they're going back to the X and Y era with that big synthesized sound that they've got with it. So I feel like this is a really, really good track to end the album off with. Okay, so I've talked about the music. Now on to the third part of the missteps. And I've already kind of mentioned a little bit of the missteps within this album. Like, as I mentioned, when it hits hard, it hits really hard. I love that first half of the album. When it doesn't hit hard, it doesn't. I see what the band is trying to do. But I feel like... Okay, the best way that I can put this, because I'm trying to think of the best way that I can talk about it, because this album in some respects does piss me off. I'm not gonna lie, it does really piss me off. It gets my blood boiling in certain respects. And I think the best way to kind of talk about this is to talk about an artist that is already doing what Coldplay is trying to do but failed, and this artist has done but succeeded. And that's already, as I mentioned, Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel back in the 80s and 90s was really infusing world music into his music. But the main difference is he also gave a platform for those who were performing on his albums within his own record company of Real World. And Real World puts out phenomenal world music, like music from all over the world. He's utilizing what I like to call own voice. I'm going to use some of my librarian terminology here. There's a movement right now known as own voice, where we want books to showcase diverse reads, and the best way to do that is through a diverse means with a diverse author. At least with Peter Gabriel, whenever he infuses that world music into his own voice, like his own aspect, he provides a huge platform for those individuals that are performing on his album. Coldplay doesn't do that. Ugh. Like, there's nowhere on the runtime or the lists here in any of the albums on Spotify or any other streaming services to list who has come in to help provide some consultation. Because I heard that they went around the world researching and working with other musicians and having them guest appear on this album. But at the end of the day, they just slap the Coldplay logo on it and call it Coldplay. And I mean, I don't want to say it's colonizing of music, but it kind of is. Like, I mean, that is the very definition of going around the world, taking whatever's there, slapping your own name on it and saying it's yours when really you stole it from other people. Even though you are, you're jamming with them, it looks like you're having a good time in your music videos. And this is definitely found on my two favorite albums, as I've already mentioned, Trouble in Town and Aberesque. Trouble in Town, I mean, if you're going to talk about power struggles between police officers and the citizens, do you really want a British cis white dude that's telling you about this, who's in his middle age? Not the kind of person you want to have talk about that, especially when you're following it up with Broken, which is like a very happy gospel kind of, I hate to say it, but a very black sound. It's like, yeah, the power struggle between the cops and the citizens in certain areas of the United States are extremely hostile. And then you're going to follow it up with a gospel sound, like a church, like everything's fine, everything's good. Like, no, no. And Aberesque is also cringeworthy, where, again, here's this very wealthy, very privileged, very, like, individual going, oh, you could be me, and I could be you. No. What are you doing, man? Like, nobody could be you. You were married to Gwyneth Paltrow. Of course nobody could be you. You could barely even be you. Like, what are you talking about? You are the worst person to have trying to spout these idioms. At least with Peter Gabriel, he never went out and said, oh, anybody could be me and I could be anybody. Like, Pink Floyd summed this up perfectly within echoes of strangers passing in the street, by chance two separate glances meet, and I am you and what I see is me. Like, that's all you had to say. And also, a lot of these, like, separate feels around, I mean, it didn't really even go all that deep. Like, I don't feel any, like, Middle Eastern feels on this. I don't feel any, like, Chinese or Japanese or any of those, like, really deep Asian countries feels on this. I don't even feel any, like, Russian or Scandinavian. Like, if this is supposed to be everyday life and you're trying to capture everyday life, you've got 16 tracks to do so. And you only really glaze over a few. So I feel like this is a really misstep over all of that. And at the end of the day, it really drags the album down for me, because I see how pretentious this album's trying to be. Now, I do understand that this is all coming from a good place, and I do understand that Martin's trying to bring a lot of really good energies and a lot of good messages to it, but, buddy, you gotta take a step back, and you really gotta think about what you're saying, because it can come off being really pretentious and not helping the situation at all, especially with you so high up in that royal palace of yours. So yeah. Overall, I mean, this album isn't as bad as I'm making it out to be. It is definitely streets ahead of Head Full of Dreams by a long shot. I don't think it's anywhere close to being as good as, like, that whole 2000s decade. This album doesn't come close to it. It's definitely not as good as Ghost Stories, in my opinion. But it's probably along the same lines as, say, Milo Oxylodo, or however you pronounce that. But yeah, as I mentioned, already streets ahead of Head Full of Dreams. So yeah, the music, when the music's good, it's good. I think there's just a little too much wandering around. They probably should have shaved off about 4 or 5 minutes off of that first disc, and they probably should have rejigged some of the songs a little bit just to kind of fill up a full album side. So that one is Sunrise, the other one's Sunset. But I mean, other than that, it was still a good time. This is one that I would probably download. You know, it's a good listen, even though, you know, I've got my qualms with it. But again, that's more of a me problem. I fully recognize that that is a me problem. So, what did you guys think of Everyday Life by Coldplay? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.